Good evening. This is Debra V. Wilson. It is Thursday, the 7th of February 2019. The time is 2300 hours and 55 minutes, and that's GMT plus 2, and I'm in Haifa. So a quick video. I was just thinking, so my three countries of interest of research are Canada, Israel, and the UK. When I was in Canada giving a presentation, I won't name the event, it's not a secret, it's online, but someone asked me why the three countries, and the person this person said, who is a person who has some professional girth around issues of security in Canada. He said, I can understand why you want to compare Canada, Israel, and the UK feminist, looking at national security model from a civil society's perspective, how civil society, specifically women, experience and respond to the nation's national security model. He said, I understand Israel and the UK, but not Canada. Well, I would argue, but anyway, okay. I'm hypersensitive to caffeine, and I've just had some diet Coca-Cola way too late, so I'm more hyper than normal. But anyway, here we go. So, and I was trying to explain to him, and I think I did an adequate job of it. So I'm going to try to explain again. One of the advantages that British feminists have collectively is they're not only punching above their weight, but they're able to travel the globe and go to different countries and engage with feminists easily from around the world. And relatively speaking, it's easy for different nationalities of feminists to travel to the UK. Okay? That's not the case for Israeli feminists. Most left-leaning activists, I don't like to make general statements. I think the incidence, proportionally speaking, of foreign left-leaning feminists traveling to the UK to work with feminists is probably higher, proportionally speaking, than that same pool of people, women, feminists, left-leaning, traveling to Israel to work with Israeli feminists. Okay? And then civil society actors out of the UK tend to be viewed as more autonomous, so that activists, and I'm speaking left-leaning activists out of the UK, aren't held responsible for the behavior of the government, no matter how you construct the behavior of the British government, right? That's not the case for Israeli activists. Before I ever came to Israel, and the first time I visited Israel was 2017, 2009, and this is my second time, 2019. But 2017, an Israeli feminist told me about the instances of Israeli feminists at foreign events, feminist events around the globe, and being asked to leave because they were Israeli, or being demanded by other feminists from other nations to disavow what Benjamin Netanyahu was doing. I'm acutely aware of that. I've actually seen it in a couple of countries. I've seen it in the UK, and I've seen it in Canada. So there is, British feminists can have, I think, relatively speaking, amassed an international girth and ability to move around the globe that is just more problematic for Israeli feminists. That's my belief, okay? But nevertheless, I think there's similarities, and one of the frustrations I find in the left feminists well, feminists in general, in the UK and feminists in Israel, is that if there was more communication, I think that the particular specifics about working in as a feminist, looking at national security model from a bottom-up perspective as a woman, whether you're a feminist or not, in spaces and places where there are protracted conflicts. So this is an advantage that the Israeli feminists have, be it Jewish or Arab or however they define, is no one disputes that Israel is in a space of conflict. And so therefore it is completely acceptable for those feminists to discuss how they operate, thrive, and survive in such a conflict. The Prime Minister openly talks about it. The heads of the intelligence agencies openly talk about it. You don't have to look very long or hard to find a YouTube video from Benjamin Netanyahu, the PM, Nadav Argaman, the head of the Shabak, the internal spying agency, or Yoshi Cohen, the head of the Mossad, and that's the outlooking intelligence agency. Nevertheless, you don't have to look very hard and long to find they're validating this conflict spaces here, okay, in Israel. Again, you might have varying ways of constructing how this country ended up in a conflict, but the fact that this country is in a space and place of conflict, you're not going to get very much disagreement. Theresa May, let's remove Brexit for the moment. Theresa May can't do that. Theresa May has to, no matter what's happening in the UK, we're all together, we're all British, we're all in this together. No matter how the internal spying agency in the UK, which is headed by Andrew Parker, no matter how he constructs that, he can't say we're at a war. We're at a war. We're at a conflict with our fellow citizens. Alex Younger, which is the outlooking spying agency for Britain, MI6, can't do that. The counterterrorism police, which is headed by Mr. Neil Basu, he can't sit there and say we're at war. Okay, we're at war with our fellow citizens. No, that's not even language that can ever be used. So there's this, but the reality on the ground is, if the ways in which some activists, myself included, have had to engage with the state was through a prism of the country dealing with perpetual violence, and what that does to the state model, and then what that does when you're a civilian and a female civilian looking at that model and poking at it and saying, what are you doing, what are you doing, what are you doing? And then there comes the issue of personal safety as civilian actors, and women in particular, and what that looks like. So I always, the ability to travel, I am a religious person, I think is a gift from God. The ability to be able to come into Israel and to have conversations with feminists, and to look at the ways in which feminists position themselves in spaces of conflict, perpetual conflict, unfortunately, to me is a learning experience. And to contrast and look at the ways in which we as feminists in the UK, in spaces and places of undeclared perpetual potential for violence towards the state, and what that has looked like for us as activists who are women, who have been at times critical of the national security model. Okay, so then I look at Canada, and back to the gentleman that asked me why did I include Canada in this. The group that I would look at as being recipients of perpetual violence and having constantly to look at the security model from a bottom-up perspective, and the state not always having the most harmonious relationship with the state, would be indigenous women and girls, and the issues around murdered, missing indigenous women and girls. So I think there are a multitude of ways that we can look at each other and say what we don't have in common, but I also think that there are a multitude of ways in which we can look at each other and learn from each other, and perhaps learn ways that might make our work, our journey, a little better, easier, less stressful. I also want to add that every once in a while you have a person that comes out, and Sarah Khan, I'm going to mention, it's quite, just saying her name is quite emotive in the UK. Sarah Khan, Maryam Namazi. Sarah Khan is, I don't define her as an activist any longer. She was an activist. Maryam Namazi is an activist, but both have given voice to, at times, the less than safe space that has existed for women activists. Murdered, missing indigenous women and girls in Canada, the attorney Pam Palmater, and many others have given voice to the continual journey of feminist activists in a very precarious situation, and not always the most friendliest environments, and what that's like. And women in Israel. Talk about, you have to look, I believe, you have to look to find those testimonies, and you have to be interested in looking and finding those testimonies, and you have to be interested in finding where we're similar, and where we can learn from each other. So now, I did say it's late at night, and I've had too much caffeine, so I'm a bit flustered here, but I'm going to try to stay focused. So in terms of personal safety as an activist in Britain, I became acutely aware. Sometimes you see things clearer from a distance. When I was in Canada and talking with the activists there, and they were overwhelmingly white and at least middle class and highly educated activists, and I thought about this personal security model that I and feminists that I worked with in the UK adopted, and it was extraordinary, the difference. And it's not to minimize, I'm not minimizing the struggles and challenges of some white feminist activists in Canada. Clearly, I wouldn't know. I haven't interviewed all white feminist activists and women in Canada. But one of the things that brought to light of the challenges in the UK was being outside of the UK, and metaphorically speaking, looking across the pond and looking at what I saw in Canada for some activists. And actually, in terms of personal security, seeing that I was actually more aligned with my activism, thinking of myself from in the UK, that the way in which I occupied the space I was in was much the same way many indigenous women activists do in terms of how I constructed my personal safety. So I want to end this on the title of this podcast, The World's Worst Electrician. Over the years, I've had the opportunity to interview people who were civilians, who claimed they were traveling to various parts of the world outside of the UK to engage in military fighting. Okay? Don't know if they were telling the truth. Obviously, I don't have the ability, nor did I seek to travel to these countries they mentioned to verify their story. But in any case, I had a particular event I went to, and there were a few young men that came and told me about their travels to the Middle East and their fighting there. So later that night, I was at a B&B in London, and the world's worst electrician showed up with a quite posh accent and leather shoes on, and with I don't know if he was the owner of the B&B or the manager of the B&B, and the gentleman at the B&B was petrified of the electrician with a very posh accent and the wonderful dress shoes on, but appeared to be the world's worst electrician because it was supposedly a problem with my overhead light, which I hadn't had on, but he didn't seem to be interested in that. I stepped out of the room. Okay, he was extremely respectful. He was extremely respectful. So was the manager of the B&B, but the manager of the B&B was hyperventilating, literally. In any case, the world's worst electrician scanned my room. He looked around the room, and then he said, he told me I was correct. There was nothing wrong with the light, and he bowed his head towards me and said, "Madam, I do apologize for interrupting." Very well spoken, sounded highly educated, but world's worst electrician. And I always think about that. And it was coincidentally the same day that some young men had done this confessional, an unsolicited confessional, in which they told me about regaled me, quote unquote, with their tales of travels around the Middle East and fighting. And I thought about that recently, being here again in Israel, and I thought about the spaces that we occupy as women who are in civil society, looking at national security models and extremism and violence that some citizens engage in, and how the state responds to it. And I also think about Sarah Khan, who is now the commissioner for the lead commissioner for the Commission for Countering Extremism, and she talks about the extraordinary risk that some activists, she's talking in general, but I'm going to give a shout out to women activists. And I think about that night, and I think about the night that whoever this young man was, that clearly knew that I knew he wasn't the electrician, and I thought that the state exposed themselves that way because they were concerned. And I thought about the spaces that many activists operate in the UK, and continue to operate in to give service. And then I think about the binaries here in Israel and how activists, feminist women activists, maneuver through those binaries and are constructed, not just women, but I'm focusing on women activists, and are constructed as the other by everyone, by all parties and quote-unquote sides. And I look in Canada, and I look at the murdered, missing Indigenous women and girls and the activism that has emerged from that, and the ways in which those activists are sometimes in precarious security situations. And so tonight, when I'm looking at similarities and differences, I thought about the world's worst electrician that someone sent to my hotel room because of something that they were concerned about. I think that's it. This is Debra V. Wilson. I'll post more and soon. I'm in Haifa, Israel. Thank you.